after Attorney General Bill Barr announced he does not expect a criminal investigation into Obama or Biden, as the John Durham probe into the origins of the Russia investigation continues. The president is now weighing in. Watch.
I think Obama and Biden knew about it. They were participants, but so I'm a little surprised by that statement. If it was me, I guarantee they'd be going after me. In his case, they're not. So I think it's just a continuation of a double standard. I'm surprised by it. I have no doubt that they were involved in this hoax, one of the worst things ever to befall this country.
Meanwhile, Senate Judiciary Chair Lindsey Graham plans a vote next month to subpoena dozens of former Obama intelligence officials. Look at the list. It includes James Comey, Andrew McCabe, among others. However, Democrats are accusing Senator Graham of trying to distort what they say really happened in 2016.
His committee will soon consider subpoenas related to another conspiracy theory pushed by President Trump, this time to try and rewrite the history of Russian interference in the 2016 election to match the fantasy in President Trump's head. That wild conspiracy theory aimed at somehow smearing the fine reputation that President Obama has well deserved.
Power panel now. To start the show, Jason Chaffetz, former House Oversight Committee chairman, Mo Elleithee, former Democratic National Committee spokesperson. Both are Fox News contributors. Jason, I'm going to start with you. The president's saying that he's surprised that the DOJ is not going to look into Biden and former President Obama. That seems like an interesting word to use. I would imagine he might feel a little stronger than that because it had looked at one time like AG Barr might do that. What changed?
I think the president is frustrated. I assume surprised. That's what he said. But I got to tell you, I think Attorney General Barr has just decided to follow the facts and follow the evidence. And I think the people that Lindsey Graham wants to call before the committee is the ability of the country and the Congress to pursue the facts and let those lead us to where they might. I see Democrats trying to say, hey, we don't need nothing to see here. Let's just move along, instead of matching that with a curiosity and saying, yeah, let's have all those facts out on the table and let's see where the truth leads us. That's where I see the Attorney General going. That's where I see the Congress going, and I think that's the appropriate path to follow.
You know, Mo, particularly with James Comey, because we've known the problematic relationship even he had with Hillary Clinton that summer right before the election, when he was saying, you know, weighing in on some of the charges against her, some of the things that they were looking at legally against her. What is your take on all of this in terms of what's coming up in June and who we're going to hear from?
Yeah, I don't know who we're going to actually hear from. But what is interesting to me is that, you know, this is an attorney general who has had no problem carrying the president's political water up till now. And even he is speculating that there isn't anything criminal to investigate here, or that there won't at least be criminal proceedings. And that makes sense because there was nothing criminal done here. That this whole unmasking thing really just seems to me to be overblown hype designed to kind of distract from a whole host of other things. Because simply put, there was an investigation going on about Russian interference in the election. It's plain and simple, which everybody agrees happened, that there was some level of Russian interference in the election. And when an American citizen, unnamed in intelligence reports, was seen speaking to the Russian ambassador, a bunch of folks in the government said, wait, hold on, who is that? That's what unmasking is. There's nothing nefarious about that. And somehow it's turned into this grand conspiracy theory.
And Mo, I get all of that, but that's not the question of illegality here. It's the leaking. Jason?
It is the leaking. That's against the law. I mean, you have one person doing unmasking the morning Donald Trump was actually going into his inauguration. You have a Samantha Powers who's running the United Nations saying, well, I know all these things happened under my name, but I didn't ask for them. Aren't you curious to figure out who is abusing the system and violating somebody's Fourth Amendment rights? There's no curiosity. And I'm sure, Mo, that if this was done on the Democrats, you'd just be, nothing to see here. Let's just keep going on. It's one of the most abusive uses of power we've ever seen. We have over 1,000 pages from the Inspector General talking about how corrupt that Department of Justice was. And you just think we should just set it aside? And Schumer just thinks we should not look here? That is ridiculous.
Real quick, and we'll move on.
The greater abuse of power here was the fact that Michael Flynn lied to the FBI, pled guilty to it.
Mo.
And then, Jason, please stop interrupting.
No.
Okay, so that was an abuse of power. He pleaded guilty to it, and the Attorney General went against his own prosecutors on that in a very political move. But what this whole thing is wrapped around, this whole matter of unmasking, is not an abuse of power. In fact, if it was, then we ought to be looking into the Trump administration, which has ramped up the number of unmaskings. That's not spin, that's data, that's fact, that there are more unmaskings being done by the Trump administration than there was by the Obama.
But we can agree that unmasking is not the crime. It is potentially the leaking of information. It will be interesting to hear from the former director of the FBI, if we indeed do, or if it's just via the investigators as they talk with him in June in the Senate. All right, we'll move on to this. House Democrats have just told the U.S. Supreme Court that they're in the midst of an ongoing impeachment, a new impeachment inquiry, as they seek to obtain redacted grand jury material from the Mueller investigation. And President Trump, again, ripped the Democrats' first impeachment effort, reminding them of the failure in the Senate. Watch.
He was a fake whistleblower, and it was a phony, disgraceful period of time. And we came out well. You know why we came out well? Because everyone recognized it for what it was, just a political witch hunt. The Republicans were so unified, not because they all liked me, but because they knew this was a horrible thing that happened.
Boy, I got to tell you, the House could have pressed for that information in the Mueller report that was grand jury, that was protected at the time. They could have pressed for that, but they didn't. And now we have a whole new entree of this. Mo, was this strategic is my first question for you, and I'll just feather this in too. Democrats lost in the Senate the first time. Did they want to remind the American voters of that failure so close to an election?
Well, I think what you're seeing here are Democrats in the House reacting to very new information, very new developments with, as we were referencing in the last topic, the Attorney General's decision in the Flynn case, the way they're handling the Roger Stone case, and Democrats now saying, okay, as Jason just said, it is the role of Congress to conduct oversight and to see where the facts take them. So now trying to see if there is any sort of connection here between these decisions being an abuse of power. And I don't think there's a lot of people itching to jump into impeachment. I don't think there were a lot of people itching to jump into it the last time. And what Democrats are saying this time...
I don't know, but when you say that word around voters, they think two things. And I don't know about them wanting to think about this in a pandemic. American taxpayer dollars that yielded something that didn't happen for Democrats in the Senate. And I'm going to go to Jason on this. And in fact, there is a pandemic going on. And can they walk and chew gum at the same time? And if they can't, can we just choose the crisis? Jason?
They can't seem to walk and chew gum. They're not even in session there in the House of Representatives, not even scheduled to come back until July 22nd. But let's remember that the Inspector General did all kinds of reports. Do you see Jerry Nadler or Chairman Maloney calling these people before Congress to go figure out the facts on what Inspector General Horowitz found? No, they didn't even invite him up to go, and they're in the majority. So don't try to pretend, Mo, that the Democrats are really curious about this sort of stuff. They have tools, but they don't want to hear the truth. And the Inspector General put out reports. They don't even invite him up to present that.
Well, the president's been firing
Well, real
Inspector
quick
General
rebuttal.
left and right. But but look, the Attorney General made two very curious decisions when it came to Flynn and when it came to Stone. That is something that oversight, that Congress has oversight over, and I think it's fair for them to look into it.